Hi, everybody. This is Joanne from Read Science, and I'm here with my co-host, Jeff Schomeyer. And we are joined today by Marta Zaraska. And we're so glad to be talking to you today about your new book called Growing Young. Let's see, the subtitle, How Friendship, Optimism, and Kindness Can Help You Live to 100. So it's things that are more important than exercise and diet, right?
Yes, that appeared so.
It's great. So I'm going to read your bio just from the back of the book, if that's okay. So Marta Zaraska is a Canadian-Polish science journalist. She has written about nutrition and psychology for the Washington Post, Scientific American, The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, and New Scientist, among others. She is the author of Meat Hooked, The History and Science of Our 2.5 Million Year Obsession with Meat. So that was your first book, and this is your second then.
I mean, in English, yes.
In English, oh, so we have other languages, Polish or?
I started writing in Polish, yes, but my first books were actually novels. So Meat Hook was my first book in English and my first nonfiction book as well.
Nonfiction book? Oh, I didn't know that. I'm sorry I didn't investigate you more. I'd like to learn more about that. So.
Too obscure, I guess.
No, well, I mean, yeah, I'm not always on that lookout for books written in Polish, even though I have a tiny bit of Polish in my background.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay. It's going to become pretty clear pretty fast what it is that we're talking about. But I wanted to read two quotations from your book, one from very near the beginning and one from very near the end, which sets up a little question that I want to ask rhetorically to start talking about all these things. The first one, I think, was from the introduction, and you talked about some research you were doing, and you said, and out of this research, a new story began emerging, whether I liked it or not, that my sit-ups and kale juice were not as important to health as I used to think.
Mm-hmm.
And then toward the very end of the book, and I'm not going to give away the last sentence, which I thought was brilliant, by the way. You said friendships, purpose in life, empathy, kindness. Science shows that these soft health drivers are often more powerful than diet and exercise. And then I thought, this is rhetorical, but I thought for rhetorical purposes, I would be the hard-nosed physicist, hard-nosed. And I tend to be reductionist. But you've given us a very different look at some of these, what you referred to as soft issues, because we're starting to understand, science is starting to understand, and even popular mind is starting to understand that there is something to satisfy even the hard-nosed physicist who says, fine, you've got a new effect. I want to know what causes it and what the mechanism is that might be doing it. And so I don't think I had any objection to years of mind-body issues. If we feel better, if we do this, blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
But it is emerging now, and you've summarized all these things brilliantly for us, that there are chemical, biological, biochemical things going in our body that understanding is arriving. And I wonder if we could just summarize a few of those so that we have some basis then for all of these examples that we're going to talk about, because many of them were new to me, and I had to keep looking to see what the HPA axis was, but I know it's going to keep coming up. So I wonder if we can just sort of set the stage for what these biochemical interactions are that mediate what you're calling here a mind-body issue.
Yeah, so just like yourself, many people, when they hear about the soft drivers of health and kindness, optimism, friendships, our community involvement, and how they impact our health and longevity, they often assume that this is some kind of new agey thing because it just sounds new agey. But the truth is, there's just so much research out there, very serious, very down to earth biological, neurological research that shows that there is nothing new agey about it. It's just basically how we evolved. It's purely physiological. We are social apes. Just like our cousins, the chimps, we evolved to be surrounded by others. And this is how our bodies prosper, because we have certain systems that function the best when we can trust others, when we are bonded with others, when we can rely on them, and when we are not alone.
Mm-hmm.
And there are plenty of different systems in our bodies, like you've mentioned before, that interact, and it's a complicated network, right? There's not just like one single thing that causes this or one single thing that causes it. It's all interlaced. That's how our bodies are in general. And so, for example, we have this network of social hormones, of social neuropeptides, such as oxytocin, serotonin, vasopressin, endorphins, that connect the way we are connected to other people, our social lives, our trust, our bonding, to purely physiological processes. So you have probably the most famous is oxytocin, right? This is what people often call the love hormone, although that's simplification because it's not just that. But it does make us feel all warm and fuzzy when we are around other people. For example, when we're holding hands or looking deeply into each other's eyes, or just giving each other hugs, for instance. And on the other hand, oxytocin, just like all the other neurohormones here that I mentioned, have also purely physiological effects on our bodies. So, for example, oxytocin can lower the inflammation processes in your body. It can promote bone growth. It really does affect your body directly. The same, for example, for serotonin, that in mice can even regenerate the liver, and humans have effects on our vascular health, on Alzheimer's disease. It's all very, very connected. On one hand, very emotional and kind of what we call exactly this kind of soft or whatever, like the mental part. The other very physiological effects. Endorphins, for example, make you feel bonded with other people. It make you feel that you belong, and you get a release of them, for example, when you are doing line dancing with other people or singing together. And on the other hand, they are also natural painkillers. So this is very, it's all connected. So these are the social hormones. Yes, that's
connected as biological systems are. I'm always amazed, being a physical scientist, at reading about biological mechanisms and biochemistry, not only with how connected it is, but how natural selection and then the process of evolution has not repurposed always, but even added layers of utility to some of these existing, hormonal systems. And then while you were talking, it made me think that at least in English, there is a remarkable ambiguity with the phrase, "Oh, I feel good."
Yeah.
That kind of both things, because that's, it's like, "Are you happy today?" "I feel good." Or, "How's your health?" "I feel good." But these two things start to work very closely together when the way we feel physically we can see how it affects feelings, and all of these evolve together to make us the social apes that we are, like you say. It's a big system. And I wonder if here's a specific question for me, for you and Joanne, I think even. I'm not sure that I understand what inflammation really is. And I wondered if you could give me a brief overview of the biological process of inflammation, particularly since with the COVID coronavirus instance, cytokines are very, very much in the news today. And we don't really have to talk about that. But what is inflammation? And it figures in the middle of a lot of these processes that we're talking about.
So, Jan, do you want to try to tackle this one on?
It's been a while since I've had to teach about inflammation. But
I take aspirin. It's like, oh, I've got an inflammation. It's like I get puffy and something hurts. But there's a whole thing going on.
So you want the initial,
I'm thinking about the reductionist biochemical response.
Like the redness and the pain and the immobility.
Yes, and what are all these proteins doing, and what triggers them to go? And I don't know.
I should have been given a warning that I needed to.
I should
pull
have
out my-
said warning. I'm going to ask about inflammation, but that's all right.
Especially in relation to coronavirus, which is not exactly my topic of expertise.
We can also talk about the hypothalamus. Let's see, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the amygdala.
Okay,
if you
then
want
I can
to,
talk more.
Yeah, that's
coronavirus.
Right. Because I looked it up again. It's like I have to remember what this HPA axis is because it keeps coming up and it figures in a lot of these processes that connect how we're feeling with how we're feeling.
Yes, that's the Hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Axis. It is a mouthful. That's why HPA usually, is easier to remember. And this is one of the biggest links between our mental health, our social health, let's call it, and how our bodies are functioning, because it all starts in your hypothalamus, in your brain, and it's basically a stress response, the kind of part of our evolved fight or flight response from when we're back, in the savannah, and we had to have these processes to basically protect our life, and so there is a cascade of hormones basically that gets released when it starts with the hypothalamus when you detect danger. Let's say a lion, standing in the bushes there out to get you, and it all basically cascades down your body. There's just so many different hormones that get released. It involves things like, for example, cortisol, and it activates your adrenal glands over your kidneys. But there is just much more. I don't want to go too much details because it's a very complicated, plenty of different hormones. But cortisol is usually the one that people recognize very fast, and this is something that we still have, even though in modern times it's very often malfunctions because it doesn't have, we are not in the same conditions anymore. So very often this HPA axis these days gets chronically activated by minor chronic stresses, for example, like mortgage stresses or stresses about college admissions and things like that. Whereas in the past, it was much more survival and very sudden, and then it would be calmed down by an opposite system that release other hormones to make sure that everything settled down in your body. But these days, very often it's all chronically activated, which has all these negative effects on our health that we usually connect to exactly stress. And on the other hand, also this HPA axis, it comes down when we are surrounded by others, by people we trust, when we are in our tribe. And this is how we also evolved. But this is exactly the system that connects, your mind, your social life with all this down the stream physiological effects, including your metabolism, for example. That have nowadays often negative impact on our health.
And so we can see from that, at least in a way that sort of satisfies me, that there is a mechanism that this does tie stress to a lot of different things about how we actually feel, and then how our emotional responses run. And then one other thing that I guess was a question while I was reading, or near the beginning, it got settled for me pretty quickly. But here is just one statement from where you said, partway through the book, here are some statistics. And you said, a happy marriage equals a 49% lower mortality risk. We can talk about mortality risk. But this sounds enormous. And part of the point is, it is enormous.
It is enormous.
Compared to, eating acacia berries and kale, as you would say, that for people obsessed with like, what's one thing I can do or something like that, these are not small effects.
No, yeah, they're huge. They're even bigger, than quitting your smoking habit of pack a day, which
that's amazing. That's amazing.
Exactly. I never say, don't quit smoking and get married instead. Absolutely not. Compare the effects, how important these things are to our health, right? That there was this one meta-analysis I like in particular that exactly put everything together, from smoking to, diet, exercise, and also all this social drivers, so social integration and marriage and living with someone and having friends and so on, and exactly to put it into perspective. And it really made it very clear, how important our social lives are for our health, and even to compare to things as bad for us as smoking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I guess just to summarize for people listening who haven't read the book yet, but like the book now is your examination of the research and what the research tells us about all of these things that we think of as soft issues or as emotional connections or social connections and things, and how they compare with all the things that fascinate Americans about their special diets and their superfood of the week and all of these things, and how surprisingly similar the comparisons are, and how important having a good relationship is with someone and with your community.
To even make it more drastic, actually, because you said that there's super diets and super foods, but actually when we are talking super diets and super foods, these are not at the best just have a minor positive impact on your health, and very often they have no impact on your health, and sometimes even negative in terms of some supplements. When I'm comparing the soft drivers of health to diet and exercise, I'm just talking about healthy diet in its simplest form, right? So eating your 6 portions of fruits and veggies a day, and having your regular exercise routine. And I'm absolutely not talking about eat goji berries, drink kale, and and invest in exercise gadgets that count your steps. No. This is absolutely not about that. It's comparing to this very basic, simple, healthy nutrition, not about the obsessive, fat diets and miracle foods, and which are, as I've said, at best, a minor improvement.
And so out of the context of the book is different in the context. 2/3 the way along or so, you say, if you can do just one single thing for your health and longevity, that thing should be finding a great partner and committing to the relationship. Yeah, that's going to surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, and for some people, this can be bad news, I guess. But on the other hand, most Americans, well over 90%, do get married at some point in their lives, and even more are in a committed romantic relationship in some point of their lives. And when you think about it, how much time we invest into reading about fat diets, about nutrition, about some miracle foods, about supplements and herbal supplements and vitamins, and how much time we invest into buying the gadgets for exercise and signing up for classes and finding the best apps to make our abs strong and whatsoever. And on the other hand, how much time do we put into our relationships, right? Do you put, because we should be putting more. So if you are spending, let's say, 30 minutes a day on your reading about nutrition or thinking about nutrition or exercise, you should be putting at least 45 minutes, let's say, into your marriage quality. And are you doing that? So this is exactly the thing that I'm trying to make clear, that we should be putting at least as much effort. And if we do, relationships need work. I think that's kind of an obvious thing that most of us heard, but we often tend to forget in our busy lives. But we should really make it a priority. And there are ways that you can work on your relationships to make them better, and also, in the end, improve your health.
Right. Yeah. And I think I had heard this statistic before, and I can't remember the exact number, but that husbands benefit even more from the marriage than the wives. And it's actually a huge number. It was like a 70-something increase in well-being. It was amazing.
The amazing thing is that there is quite a lot of research that shows that for men, even a bad marriage is better for health than no marriage, which, when you think about it, it is rather surprising. And it probably has something to do with just the feeling of having someone out there for you, and also from the fact that women are usually the ones in the relationship who take care about general relationships of the couple, so your social lives. And when men are married, they are much more likely to be integrated in the community and having friends and more social relationships. But it is a surprising effect, because for women, generally, it's happy marriage that matters. But for men, even not a very happy one can do that too. So.
There's, as you work through all of these studies and things and put together the big picture from the smaller pieces, there are lots of fascinating examples and stories about the studies and the examples and the people of one or another thing. And I think you almost mentioned one a little bit ago, because in addition to being a scientist, I'm also a musician. And the studies about doing things in synchronicity with other people makes us feel better.
Yeah, that's rather fascinating. I first learned about it when I was visiting Professor Robin Dunbar at Oxford, so the famed anthropologist, and he's the one who started most of the research in this area, and by now there is quite a lot of studies showing exactly that synchrony has this amazing power over us. So when you, for example, play music with other people, in general, it already makes us feel connected and bonded, and helps us release endorphins. So those happy hormones, basically, that also, as I mentioned before, have physiological effects, such as they are natural painkillers. And on the other hand, when we do things in synchrony with other people, the effects can be actually double that. So sorry, I'm having a technical problem with my headphone here. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
So having just the doing the same things in synchrony can really double the effects of music or dancing or just being with other people together. Even things like tapping your fingers in synchrony with other people can already make a difference. So that's falling out.
So yes, for my friends who are line dancers, they're making themselves feel better and enhancing their longevity. People who play string quartets and people who sing in choirs and people who walk together tend to match their pace.
Yes.
Presumably because there's a little feedback mechanism that makes them feel better if they do that.
Yes, it's probably something, as you often say in neuroscience, when you don't know what's causing it's probably the mirror neurons, although so far we don't really have much research to confirm it, but there is something going on in our brains also in terms of how our brain waves get synchronized as well with other people when we are doing things together, and it probably is a feedback loop. So when you're starting to do something in synchrony, your brain waves get synchronized, which encourages even more synchrony, and it has this downstream physiological effects on you as well, also in potentially improving your health. So, which I say that it's a great thing, because when you're thinking, for example, of doing sports, if you do sports in synchrony with another person, it has even more powerful effects on you. For example, so instead of going jogging, you can go jogging with a friend, and if you do it in synchrony, so step in step, the effects will be even multiplied several times. So this is really something it's very simple to do, but on the other hand can have very powerful effects.
Mm-hmm. And not just the physical effects of the exercise. We're talking about the synchrony, which has a lot of stuff and does biochemical things, but then you also have effects that come from working on your friendships, having involvement in your community, which gets us to questions like volunteering as a life-enhancing or longevity-increasing activity, provided one is motivated to volunteer for good reasons and not just get paid for
Right.
it.
Yeah, you don't get school credit for it, or yeah.
If it's just for school credits, I'm afraid it doesn't work.
Right.
Or for your college admission,
Exactly.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work like this. You have to be really motivated by empathy and kindness. And if that's your motivation, then you do get amazing health benefits from volunteering. So we are talking about mortality rate reduction before. And in terms of volunteering, it's anywhere between 22 to 44% in mortality risk reduction, which is also tremendous, because this falls at least as much as a healthy diet and a healthy exercise routine, if not more. It really depends on the study, right? Because different studies have show different results, but at least as much as healthy diet and healthy exercise. So it's really, really powerful.
So you're talking about studies, and you participated in a few studies, or you went off to Portugal to try to, for a longevity weekend or wellness weekend or superfood, whatever. I can't remember what it was.
Longevity club.
Longevity club. So I'm wondering, so it's probably a twofold question. So which study or interaction, I know you did some actual studies and participated just to see, what your level was of your white blood cells and their activity and things like that. So which one was the most interesting to participate in? And maybe which one was, you were like, okay, this did not do much for me at all.
So the one that most fascinating was the one I did on kindness and my cortisol levels. It was done with participation from scientists from the King's College London, who helped me tremendously with the lab part of it. Of course, it was not real research because it was a sample of one.
Just one, yeah.
It doesn't work. But there is actual real research done on proper samples that confirms the same results. So, but I just really wanted to see it on myself, how it works, how it's done, and how it feels. And so what I've done is that for a week, I chose 3 days on which I would be doing acts of random kindness, and 4 other days that will be just my control days. And each and every day over that week, 3 times a day, I took my cortisol. I measured my cortisol by chewing on cotton swabs. That was a very unpleasant part. I would have never imagined how horrible it is to chew for 2 minutes on cortisol swabs. And then all these swabs got sent off to a lab at King's College, where the scientists measured my cortisol levels and charted them, because it's not as simple as low levels or high levels. It's about how they change throughout the day, which tells you about whether you have a healthy stress response, basically, or not. And on those 3 days when I was doing acts of random kindness, I would sit in the morning and basically plan my day. What nice things can I do and for whom? It was really amazingly fun. I loved doing that. It just felt really, really good. And so, like bake cookies for my husband's colleagues at work, or, just buy a sandwich for a homeless person, like just things like that, right? And then when the results came in, it really showed that on those 3 days that I was doing kindness, my cortisol response was much, much healthier than on the other days, even though one of those kindness days was also particularly stressful for me for personal reasons. And yet it really didn't show on the cortisol level. Because the kindness somehow balanced it out and neutralized this stress that I was having. And as I mentioned before, there are proper studies on big numbers of volunteers that show exactly the same thing, that doing kindness actually improves our stress response.
That's like amazing. And so was there a study that was like, or something you participated in that was dubious? You're like, I'm not so sure I'm getting results that I should.
I mean, it wasn't dubious for scientific reasons. It was dubious for the fact that I was not good at it. And that was a meditation study. So that was also done in London with scientists from Oxford University, and the whole thing was to check the response of my leukocytes to meditation. And basically, when people meditate, their leukocytes have a, let's say, more healthy response in terms of oxygenation and response. And I was supposed to basically they measured how my leukocytes are reacting, and after, by taking a small blood sample that wasn't very pleasant, and then I had to go and meditate for, I think, half an hour, and afterwards my blood was taken again to check how my leukocyte response has changed. And unfortunately it hasn't changed much, but I'm pretty sure it's just me, because I'm just not a very good meditator. So in people who are proper meditators, that long-term meditators, the changes are much more pronounced, and you can actually see better results. Although in truth, also meditation, when you compare it to things we've talked before, like volunteering, for example, or having friendships or a happy, healthy marriage, is less important in terms of numbers here than those other things.
Maybe because we don't have, it's just not a culture of meditating and, making this something that happens every day. So the number of serious meditators that we see good results from is lower. And yeah, the things we can do, we are in control if we want to do kind things and helpful things and work on our relationships.
And
I imagine
also something that you can learn to do better.
You could, always learn.
Right. So
so
your meditation becomes more effective, I guess,
over time. Yeah, if you want to work on it. So I just was wondering. So this is the first book I've seen about these recently about different factors to help keep you young. So I honestly, this year I have read in less than a year, probably less, so January. So I read a book like in November by Sue Armstrong, who has been a guest on our show about P53 gene, but she wrote a book called Borrowed Time, The Science of How and Why We Age. Then early in the year was one by David Sinclair called Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. And then I also read another book called Immortality, Inc., about renegade science, Silicon Valley billions, and the quest to live forever. So a lot of these were about the actual, we see the telomeres. You mentioned telomeres, and we can talk about those. Here's what you could do. You could take this pill, and you could sleep, and you could do this, and you can do that. But they were less focused on these friendship, optimism, kindness, these softer things, these things we actually have some control over. And I thought that's interesting that, we are really looking for answers of how not to get sick and old too quickly. And so I'm wondering what motivated you to go ahead and do this book?
I mean, it was just science, it was not that I was motivated by anything particular, just finding these studies and just being intrigued and wanting to find out also for myself what really makes us healthy. Because for a very long time, I was always very interested in living healthy. So I eat healthy, and I exercise and so on. And because I've been writing about this for so many years, I wanted to see myself if I'm doing things right. I would also love there to be a pill that just, you just pop it and everything is perfect. But unfortunately, most times it's just wishful thinking, and this is not how it works. And we are the way we are, as I mentioned. Our bodies are still out there, you could say, in the savannah, and we are social species that need to certain things, this involvement with others to function properly, and no pill will replace that. And also, when you think about pills, I find it a little bit sad. You just pop something, live forever, and but isn't it more pleasant to gain the same effects or even better effects because we have no pills like that? And also be so much happier because you are with other people, you are kind, you are connected. This is just so much nicer.
It still could be a hard sell, at least in America, where, yes, the pill that takes care of the particular thing, or the superfood that solves the particular problem, seems much more popular than the fact that, if you just live a better life and enjoy it more, you'll live longer. It's like, people, I'm not going to do that.
I don't want a better life.
Yeah, but suppose for some of us, and I could use myself as an example, even that, I was much more introverted years ago. I used to be much more neurotic. I worried about things all the time. And part of what you're telling us is that science tells us that if we worry less and are involved more with people in some way, we don't have to turn into extroverts, that we will feel better and it will help us live longer. And the good news is you can learn these things. You can learn to be less neurotic. You can learn how to engage with people in a useful way that still is not awful even for introverts. And I felt that was true. I think I decided 40 years ago, why worry about certain types of things that I can't do anything about? And I practiced not worrying about them. Now, that's one thing. But you have in the book the documented things that tell us, yes, we can learn how to do these things. And in essence, we can practice them until we're better at them. And then we get the benefits, provided we're motivated in the right way to do this. Right? And that's a nice thing, that we can even learn how to be nicer people.
Totally, these are things we can learn and practice, and exercise in a very similar way. We can exercise our muscles to get them stronger. You've mentioned neuroticism yourself. This is one of the personality traits that are the most connected to our health and longevity, this one in negative way. So the more neurotic you are, the worse it is for your health. Mm-hmm. So when you think about this kind of Woody Allen characters in the movies, they would not live the longest. And yet, these are the things that can be changed through practice. Most personality traits all of them can be changed. Some of them easier, like neuroticism or conscientiousness. Some of them a little bit harder, like extrovertism, for example. But you can work on them basically by faking until you make it. So every day you do things as if you were less neurotic, or more conscientious or more extroverted, and it actually becomes a habit, and it actually changes your personality. And the same even with empathy. People just sometimes say, I'm just not a very empathetic person, but the genetic part here is really, really small. And we can really practice and learn empathy in a very similar way. We can, work on our muscles. Also, not everybody is born with the same basic, muscle development or whatever. Then some people have it easier to work on their muscles, and yet it doesn't stop us from trying. And it should be the same with empathy, And there are so many things. I also give examples in my book that you can actually do to exercise your empathy. And usually these are very pleasurable things, like reading novels, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right. One thing that was in the book that surprised me, because it was just taken for granted, it's become a part of at least Western society, the type A personality is really not a thing, or is not that big of a fact. I was like,
it's not a thing.
No. We said this since the 50s and the 60s. It's a thing.
It was a tobacco thing, actually. As I write in the book, by now we know that it was basically an invention by the tobacco industry to divert the blame from cigarettes to something else for cardiovascular problems. It was basically invented to just shift the focus on something else. And no, it doesn't exist. There is nothing like being a personality that's bad for your health or anything like that at all. It's pure invention. So now it became cultural. It's in so many books and movies, so we kind of believe it, but it's not real. What is real is a D personality, which stands for distressed, so kind of very nervous, neurotic, worrying constantly, depressive, pessimistic. So this is real, and it does have negative impact on health. But a personality, no.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that one blew me away. I went, really? No, that can't be. I'm so used to having a type A personality to, I don't have it, but, to think that, there are type A personalities getting heart attacks.
There are people who you could call type A personality, but it has nothing to do with their health or, their longevity at all.
Mm-hmm. But mentioning it as a fabrication of the tobacco industry has a bigger relevance here. It's like in your book, you walk very nicely on the side of science and not pseudoscience. But how are average people going to be able to, so that you have some tips for how to say, these over here, we have studies that show you and can do these things, and we can trace it to effects, and we understand that will help your longevity. And what do you mean drinking this tea is not going to help, or something? Do you have some tips for how to avoid the pseudoscience and maybe stick with the scientific aspects?
Read good science media.
Read your book would be one.
Yes, read my book. But in general, avoid poor quality of media. So just go for the highest, the media of the highest standards. Like, for example, Scientific American is amazing. In the UK, New Scientist, Discover. There is media out there. The Washington Post, also the New York Times. So read really the newspapers and the magazines that have the highest standards out there, and forget about everything else. Because unfortunately, there are always. First of all, there are some journalists, unfortunately, I'm among them, among journalists, but we sometimes, as journalists altogether, may be guilty of selling stories just for the sake of selling stories. And the internet, is full of things that are based on very poor science or no science at all, or misinterpretation of science. So the best tip ever is just to go and read only the best sources and forget about everything else.
And Joanne and I can agree, as as scientists, even science has its flaws, and we try to correct those as we go, but they happen everywhere because we are human beings. You do your best. Can we talk about cultural things? And just because, I don't know, Japan is fascinating, but you had a large look at what we can learn from Japan, including, where do I have it?
Oh.
Ikigai.
Ikigai.
Yes,
Ikigai.
I'm fascinated about the idea of Ikigai, purpose in life, which I feel like I'd like to come to before to figure out before I die. And I think I've seen a fascination with the Japan culture, and we look at it, we go, if we eat more rice, we'll live longer, or if we drink tea more slowly, we'll live longer, and things. And these may be true, but those are really the superficial parts that then you talk about the Japanese and their culture and the Ikigai and what it is, in addition to being a little bit shorter, that enhances their longevity, is all these socio-cultural aspects that make a sharp contrast to the way Americans tend to run their lives.
I mean, certainly, the diet plays a role, the being shorter plays a role, and some other genes. But, the fact that Japanese are the longest lived nation on the planet, they have also some cultural things we could learn from. And one of them, as you've mentioned, is the Ikigai, or what's generally translated into having the reason for living. And when I travel in Japan, this is something people talk very often about, including longevity researchers. When I talk to longevity researchers in the West, they usually start with diet and exercise, and things like purpose in life usually don't come up at all. And in Japan, it comes up very, very fast. And just like, for example, whether the society is equal or not, egalitarian or not, it also comes up very fast in the conversation about longevity in Japan. And Ikigai is recognized as a health driver to the point that the Health Ministry of Japan also says this is one of the main drivers of healthy living, having a purpose in life. And for example, nowadays the place in Japan where people live the longest is no longer Okinawa. It's actually Nagano Prefecture. So, all these books about Okinawa diet are no longer now it's Nagano. And one of the reasons that the local health authorities think are driving the longevity is exactly that the number of people who have Ikigai, or purpose in life, in Nagano are particularly high. And also, it's also the prefecture with the highest numbers of people who are working so-called silver hair jobs. And yes,
I was very excited about that.
Listeners is absolutely, at least for me, it was mind-blowing when I heard about it, and completely confusing at first. Basically, it's when people retire, but they don't really retire. Instead, they retire from their original careers, and then they go to a job agency that's called the Silver Hair Job Agency, and they look for another job to work until they basically die. And the idea here is that the job that they're having is something much, much simpler and much easier than the jobs they were doing before. So it will be, for example, being a parking attendant, or a public space gardener, or helping children cross the street on the way to school, for instance. So these are jobs, they don't do them for money. They do them purely for this kind of feeling of social inclusion and just being, useful and having a purpose in life and things like that. And it's very specific to Japan, but it also is very connected to this purpose in life and Ikigai, because the silver hair jobs are giving those people purpose in life and helping them live longer. So, and Nagano exactly is the place where those silver hair jobs are particularly popular.
And that's
right.
The useful, practical explanation. That purpose in life we tend to think of as a grand cosmic thing in America, but purpose in life is a reason to get up in the morning, or to do something, and to have a responsibility of some sort. And it does not have to be a large scale change the world purpose in order to work well, as these silver-haired jobs show us, right?
But also the important part here is this kind of giving part, because a few times I had this conversation exactly already in the West, that when people said, okay, my ikigai is playing golf. And in general, I don't think this is how the Japanese mean it. So usually it's also the part of giving to somebody else and taking care of other people is very important here. So it's not exactly the same thing as the reason to get up in the morning, not totally, right? It's much more nuanced than that, and usually involves, people say that taking care of my grandchildren, for example, is my ikigai. Volunteering in my community is my ikigai, things like that, right? So things that are very social and have this kind of giving part to them.
But I'm very impressed, and I feel almost motivated to start a silver hair society or something, because, I mean, you can see I'm beginning to think about things like silver hair jobs, and I really was delighted to read about that. And that you can talk about, but it's like, thank you. I'm just learning about silver-haired jobs has impressed me a great deal.
Well, I say, if I look at the hospital auxiliary, it is older people who are volunteering. They're retired and they've gone and they want to still be useful. They still want to get out of the house and interact with people. So it seems these ladies have been right all along.
They probably have.
So, early on you mentioned, this is your second book, and you said before you wrote nonfiction, you were writing novels. So
yes.
what's the change? And then, as far as,
mistakes of youth.
explaining science to the general public, that's a great purpose in life as far as we're concerned.
I've been a journalist all way long. Even when I was writing my novels, it was just kind of more of a hobby thing, I guess.
And did you gravitate towards science because you always had an interest in science, or it just ended up being the beat you were given? Or
I mean, so the weird thing, I'm actually a lawyer, and when I tell it to people, I finished law school, and when people hear it, they're like, oh my god, it's completely different than science, and it has nothing to do with science. But actually, I often argue that being a lawyer actually prepared me amazingly for being a science journalist, because when you think about what lawyers do, they always look for weak points in the argument, right? They look at the data to check if it holds. They try to see the argument from both sides. So this is exactly, and they also read very difficult, very badly written stacks of papers, as their job. So this sounds exactly what I'm doing right now. So even though I never practiced as a lawyer, but definitely the law school prepared me to what I'm doing right now. But I've been a journalist for over 20 years now, so it's been a long time, and I'm also married to a scientist. So here at home, we are all reading papers and talking about papers, and so yeah.
I don't know. Do you have tips for all those people who would read scientific papers? Oh.
So who wants to read scientific papers?
Well, reading scientific papers is a slog.
Yeah, like for pleasure, or
well, they might, or to become journalists. Although it's usually where I emphasize, it's like scientific papers are not meant to be read quickly.
No, that's for sure. I mean, first of all, they, as we all know, scientific papers differ in their quality tremendously as well. So you have to be very careful of what you're reading, because there is some very bad research out there, unfortunately, as well. And there are some even journals that, are not even peer reviewed, and they appear to be peer reviewed. So you have to be very careful about your sources as well, right? So look at the best journals. Once again, just like with regular media, you have to look at the top, and the ones that are, like the Lancet, for example, right? Or the BMJ. So really the best sources, because there can be some very bad sources as well.
Here's a quotation that I had from rather late in the book, and it's awfully hard not to read that in our current context of a pandemic raging around. But you say policymakers are beginning to focus their attention on issues such as loneliness and divorce rates, yet they still mostly see them as social problems, not public health issues. That should change.
Yes, totally. And it is slowly changing. I just actually read a paper today on healthcare. It was a review on healthcare costs of loneliness in the UK. And it's been calculated that the cost to healthcare in the UK from loneliness are about $1,000 per lonely person per year, which, considering that there are 9 million lonely people in the UK, that would amount to about $9 billion to healthcare costs in the UK of loneliness. So these are very, very real numbers. And the British are beginning to recognize that, now they have, since 2018, they have a minister for loneliness. So in the government, right? So these things are beginning to be recognized. The same in the Netherlands, for example, they calculated how much neuroticism costs the healthcare. And the numbers were equally great. So, each neurotic person has actually you can calculate direct healthcare costs in, additional hospital visits, lost days of work, and so on. That's the healthcare has to pay.
I think we have a particular problem with that in this country that maybe we can figure out, but because we have several things that we'd be better off treating as healthcare problems rather than social problems. I think social problems, treating it as a social problem gives us all sorts of deniability and peculiarly American ways of doing that. What comes with shifting from seeing something as a social problem to seeing it as a health problem? Practically speaking, how it's handled, how it's discussed, that would be an improvement.
I mean, generally, then it puts money signs on everything. And, when you put money on things, people start to respond better and see it more as a problem than, something in someone's mind, that we understand numbers much faster, I guess. And when you exactly say that it's $9 billion, the cost of loneliness, then people, wow, okay, that's something has to be done, right? So when it's just, okay, somebody's feeling not nice, that's much harder to measure. And we like to measure things. So I think that's puts much more of a spotlight on things and how they have to change.
But the type of solutions that you might consider to try to ameliorate these problems also is quite a bit different. It's a big perspective change, isn't it?
It is, but on the other hand, the same study I just mentioned before that I read today, it also put very direct numbers on interventions, and how each, for example, intervention, for example, £1 invested in an interventions for ameliorating loneliness can bring 1.3 pounds of return to the healthcare system. So, there are very, very direct numbers here that we can quote and of particular interventions and what can be done. So it's not all fluffy and, it's possible to measure those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, and I wondered a lot as I was reading the book. There's a lot of things here, like hugging and talking in person and, doing all these things. And maybe this is dialed back a bit with the pandemic. We can't go over and hug grandma. We can't, if we saw our aunt, we can just, run up and hug, and in cultures that hug, things like that. So, do you foresee any other, maybe health issues that may come other than directly getting sick from the pandemic?
Definitely the problem is, that social isolation is really bad for our health. And not only people who are socially isolated have shorter telomeres, but also social isolation has actually impact on our antiviral response, which is kind of worrisome when you think about it. So, for example, when people are socially isolated or feel lonely, they are much more prone to fall sick from viruses. And the studies were done on both rhinoviruses, but there were also studies done on the classic coronaviruses, the old school ones, not the which also show that, if you are stressed and socially isolated, you are much more prone to fall sick, which makes you think about the current situation and how it's complicated, right? But on the other hand, I'm quite optimistic here because I hope that what we are going through right now, maybe it's a temporary situation, right? If we were in the situation for 10 years, yes, that will be a problem. But because it's so temporary, I hope that it will just shift the focus we are having on and make us appreciate the relationships, make us appreciate how important it is to be with others and hug and be in physical contact. Many people who are now working only online are beginning to appreciate, for example, how important the meeting your coworkers at the water cooler was, right? Before they thought it was just something, a nuisance maybe, but now they see these are important things, and they are. And maybe if we realize their importance right now and recognize it, and maybe in the future it can actually boost our health because we will be more likely to invest in our social lives.
This is a huge opportunity, I hope, in the United States, because there are a lot of things being exposed, most of which are touched on one way or another in your book about the difference between health problems versus social problems, appropriate responses, all sorts of things. And then here's one more quotation that I thought bared on that. You say, one thing that kept coming up in my interviews with Japanese researchers, something that usually wasn't on the table when I talked with their Western colleagues, was the connection between longevity and egalitarianism.
Yes, that's one exactly. Those very important points to most, I think, all of the longevity researchers I talked to in Japan. That egalitarian societies, the one where Gini index, is much healthier, are actually better off in terms of longevity. And there is research out there that confirms that, exactly, even calculating, by Gini index, how it actually influences the health of nations. And Japan is definitely much more egalitarian in that regards than, unfortunately, US. And so this is another thing, we can definitely improve. And this is not only because the natural thing here is to think, okay, it improves the situation of the people who are poor, or but it's not the case. It actually improves health for everyone, even for those who are the most privileged in the society. They also benefit their health and longevity if the whole society is more egalitarian. And this is possibly for these feelings of trust, connection, bondedness, neighborliness, strength of community, which are also important to our health. The more we divide, the more we don't trust each other, the worse all this, all the hormones we talked about, the HPA axis, all this, it all malfunctions. So you cannot escape it, even if you're privileged. There's even research on gated communities and how they affect us negatively in terms of health, for exactly these feelings of trust and connection. So you cannot escape it by just, okay, I'm rich, I have privilege, doesn't matter. It does matter.
Yeah.
Interesting. So we're coming towards the end of this time together. Is there anything that we didn't mention that you wanted to say about your book?
Yeah, so I think one thing, especially when you say the title, it's like how optimism, friendship, and kindness can help us live to 100. And people often focus on this 100 part, and they tell me that they don't want to live to 100. And the thing is that I think it's a very common misconception that people assume that if you live to 100, it means you are going to be sick for a very long time. And the interesting part is that what I also discovered researching Growing Young is that when people live particularly long, they also tend to stay healthy for a very long time. So when you hear about somebody running their first marathon at 95, this is not actually something to be so amazed about. So for example, when people live to their the average lifespan, so 80 something in the West, they tend to spend about 18% of their time on Earth being sick. Whereas people who are supercentenarians, so those who live to be 110 or more, they only spend about 5% of their time on Earth being sick. And 1 in 10 of those supercentenarians actually stays healthy until the very last 3 months of their lives. So imagine that you live to be 111 and you're only 3 months sick, right? That's absolutely amazing. So it's not. It's actually the longer you live, the healthier you are. The longer you live, it's all connected. It's not that you'll live long, so you'll be sick for 30 years. It's, of course, it does happen, but it's not. It's more of an exception than a rule.
And just to clarify in my mind, you did say that in the book. You talk about longevity because it's a way you could compare situations and contributions to that, but really, the important thing is living longer means living better, feeling better, living healthier, and having a better life.
Yeah, it's not about, becoming, I never say that, also the title, Growing Younger. Actually, for me, it's mostly about growing as a person. I never mean that growing younger as in kind of the people who want you to swallow some kind of pill think about it sometimes, that become all young, beautiful, and look 20. This is not at all. I mean about staying healthy, living long, and growing as a person, right? So becoming kinder, nicer, more involved in your community, involved with your friends, and so on.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Well, this was a lovely book, and I definitely plan on passing it along to people I know. So for those of you who have not gotten a hold of the book, I suggest it, Growing Young by Marta Zaraska. So yeah, it's great. Like I'm thinking my mom's the first person to get the copy of the book.
Yeah, Joanne told me beforehand, she says, oh, I went out and actually bought a copy so that I could give it to people.
Yeah.
That's very nice.
So yeah, well, I like your style too. It was lighthearted. Like it didn't, you know what I mean? I thought some of these books about aging can be quite serious, but yours was very lighthearted, but had really good science. So I think that's just like a perfect combination. So
thank you, Joanne. It's probably the novel writing,
Yes.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us as we spoke to Marta. Marta, thank you very much. And
thank you so much.
We'll see you guys again next time on Read Science.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Marta.
Thank you.